So here we are at the end of chapter 15, and we're talking about water pollution now, freshwater pollution. So water pollution includes any changes in the chemical, physical, or biological properties of water due to human activities. The chemical properties would be things such as pH, nutrient concentrations, and dissolved oxygen concentrations, so how much oxygen is actually in the water itself. Physical properties such as temperature and turbidity. Turbidity is the density of suspended particles in a water sample. So how many solids are actually dissolved in that water? It's a physical property. And lastly, biological properties, like the microorganisms present in a water sample. So many of the impacts of water pollution are not visible. Some of them definitely are visible, but some of them are not, like the pH, the nutrient concentration, and the oxygen are not visible, so we need to chemically monitor them. There's two kinds, different sources, where you can classify water pollution by its source. The first one is called point source solution, which means that it's basically, you can identify that the pollution is coming from one given spot. Discrete meaning isolated locations that release water pollution. Non-point sources arise from multiple inputs over large areas. So this is farms, city streets, and residential neighborhoods, so not simply one factory or one farm. So here's a good diagram that shows the difference between non-point source and point source. Point source is a little bit easier. If you look right here, this oil tanker, if it leads to an oil spill, is definitely a point source pollutant. Factories and disposal sites, if they're putting their chemicals or their industrial waste into a body of water, that's point source. Sewage treatment plants, which we will talk about, as well as animal feedlots, are depositing nutrients, waste, and bacteria into the water. Animal feedlots can also be non-point source if there's many of them spread out over a large area, but if there's just one, then one can give its own pollution, then that would be a point source. The things like non-point sources would be farms, lawns, and golf courses. So basically, they are polluting more over more of a spread out area, and because of that, we're getting fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides. Residential neighborhoods and urban streets are giving us things like salt on winter roads. In places where it freezes, you have to put salt on the road so that the ice will melt. Oil, grease, and chemicals from urban runoff. And then from construction sites, deforested and overgrazed land, we get eroded soil, and from abandoned mines, we get acid drainage. So the things on this side are less of like a direct pollutant. Like you don't think of residential neighborhoods and urban streets as actually funneling pollution into waterways, but they do because of the way that runoff works. So that's more of a diluted way. This is more direct pollution. The U.S. Clean Water Act addresses point source pollution with some success by targeting industrial changes. Water quality in the U.S. today suffers from countless common activities such as applying fertilizers and pesticides to farms and lawns, applying salts to roads in the winter, and leaking automobile oil. So the U.S. Clean Water Act is working on these point source ones. But basically because of these non-point source, the water quality is pretty bad. So water pollution can take many forms, and most of them are human-made. So many types of toxic chemicals have been released into water sources, such as pesticides, petroleum products, heavy metals, and acid from precipitation and mining runoff. So these things can poison plants and animals, alter aquatic ecosystems, and cause an array of human health problems, including cancers. The toxic metals can damage human health and the environment, and the acids from acid precipitation and acid drainage from mining sites. So strict regulations can help control these. Disease-causing organisms such as bacteria and parasites can enter drinking water supplies from improperly treated sewage. Or also with animal wastes from feedlots. So specialists monitoring water quality can tell when water has been contaminated by such waste such as human wastes. And those human wastes may not be dangerous, but because they can tell that there has been human waste there, then they know that it may be polluted by other things such as typhoid or other diseases that are carried in human waste. So your book separates this better, but basically there's chemical pollution, pathogens causing pollution. Biological pollution by pathogens causes more human health problems than any other type of water pollution. Um, in the US, 20 million people each year get sick from drinking contaminated water, um, whereas the UN estimates that 3,800 children die each day of cholera, dysentery, and other waterborne diseases, because they just don't have clean water, and the wastewater from humans, the human waste is getting into their water source, and that is why we don't eat our waste because it'll make us sick. Then we also have nutrient pollution, which we've talked a lot about before. From fertilizers and other sources causes eutrophication and hypoxia in surface waters. We learned about this process before, where the the excess phosphorus and nitrogen run into the bodies of water. The algae now gets fertilized by it, so they overgrow, and this is what we talked about. As they overgrow, eventually they die, and then the bacteria eat all the dead algae and suck all the oxygen out of the water. But they can also cover the body of water and block out the sunlight needed by underwater plants. So there's a bunch of ways that eutrophication can affect a body of water. And we talked about this in regards to the Chesapeake Bay's dead zones, but there's also the Gulf of Mexico dead zone. Um, and this in the Gulf of Mexico, it's actually reduced catches of shrimp and fish to half of what they were in the 1980s because of this eutrophication and hypoxia. So eutrophication is a natural process, but like, it happens naturally. But human inputs from farms, golf courses, lawns, and sewage can dramatically increase its rate. So basically, the farms, golf courses, and lawns are fertilizers that we are actively putting on these to help plants grow. But then our sewage is also being returned to the water, and our sewage contains nitrogen and phosphorus, and so it's doing the same thing. A dead zone of very low oxygen waters has formed in the Gulf of Mexico, which is what I was just saying, due to the nutrient flow from the Mississippi and Atchafalaya rivers. So all of these things, the runoff from all these things is getting into the tributaries, into the rivers, and eventually into these rivers where it's flowing to the Gulf of Mexico, causing a dead zone. We talked about the oligotrophic water body. So this is nutrient poor and high in oxygen. And then this is a eutrophic water body, which is very, very nutrient rich and low in oxygen. So you can see how the algae is covering the entire surface of the water. So it's not, in here you can see the rocks at the bottom, which means that the sunlight is getting through, and that is not happening down here. Also, agriculture and habitat modification can cause pollution. So clear cutting, mining, and clearing land for development have all increased rates of erosion because of which leads to sediment pollution. So as these sediments are moving around, they are basically carrying eroded soils to different rivers from where they were. So some bodies of water are naturally sediment rich, but others are not. So that can really affect the composition of a river. The aquatic habitat can change drastically, and fish that are really adapted to clear water without a lot of sediment may be killed if suddenly now they have a bunch of sediment in their water and it's not as clear anymore. And we can easily prevent this, or not easily, we can prevent this by better managing farms and forests and avoiding large-scale disturbance of vegetation. So just being careful about the soil erosion. So when we talked about agriculture, we talked about the importance of preventing soil erosion. Here is another reason, because we're actually causing sediment pollution. Then we have what's called thermal pollution, which is when the temperature is different than what it naturally is in a given area. So this can happen when transferring water for coolant in a factory or power plant, then returning the warm water back. So basically, we would take water, cooler water from a body of water, and use it to run past machines or in a power plant to cool down the machinery. And then after that water has taken some of the heat off of the machinery, and now the water's temperature is increased, but then we put it back into the body of water we took it from, and now it is warmer, which will affect the changes the body of water. And the reason for that is because warm water doesn't hold oxygen as well as cold water. This is that dissolved oxygen we were talking about. So if we are increasing the temperature of bodies of water, we're lowering the availability of oxygen in that body of water, and that can really affect some native fish species and encourage invasive fish species to move in instead. And vice versa, too little heat can also cause problems. So on some dammed rivers like the Mississippi, we have created these reservoirs, and at the bottom of the reservoirs, there is it's much colder than at the top because there's not as much sunlight hitting it. And then if we end up releasing that water downstream, it's changing the temperature composition and can again um, uh, favor invasive species over native species. So, human wastes, animal manure, and pulp from paper mills and yard waste is all considered biodegradable pollution. Um, so this is pollution that is released into our waterways, and then they can also lower oxygen levels as the material is decomposed. So same way that the nutrient pollution can lower oxygen levels, the biodegradable pollution can do the same thing because the microbes, the bacteria that live in the water, are breaking down the pollution and sucking the oxygen out of the water. Then we have what's called wastewater, which is water affected by human activities, and this includes water from toilets, sinks, dishwashers, and washing machines, as well as water used in manufacturing or industrial cleaning processes and stormwater runoff. So we treat wastewater, so it has helped. Oh, we treat wastewater in developed nations, so it has helped the impacts from the biodegradable wastes, but in developing nations they haven't they don't really treat their water as much, not all of them. So sometimes up to 90% of wastewater is released untreated into the waterways, and so that's leading to oxygen depletion in their bodies of water. Groundwater pollution is a really big problem because it's much harder to clean up and to notice than surface water. Um, because it's regularly polluted by industry and agriculture, but it's hidden out of view. So the pollution can get worse and worse over decades until suddenly the drinking water is contaminated over a widespread area. And reasons for this are because groundwater, unlike rivers, retains contaminants until they decompose. Rivers' contaminants are flushed out because it's a moving body of water. Groundwater will usually just sit there until it gets broken down. And chemicals break down much more slowly in aquifers because there's less sunlight and microbes. So the heat and the bacteria, or the heat is encouraging the bacteria to do it, and there's less of those in groundwater than in surface water. Um, and over withdrawal of groundwater concentrates the pollutants that are present. So we're sucking out the groundwater and leaving the pollutants that are behind, which is increasing the concentration of them. There are a lot of sources of groundwater pollution. Some of them occur naturally because groundwater is always touching rocks, so it's leaching some of those off of there. But um, human sources include leaking underground storage tanks and the leaching of solvents and pesticides through soil. Um, if there's improperly designed wells, then pathogens and other pollutants can enter the groundwater. Underground tanks of oil and industrial chemicals can leak carcinogenic chemicals. And the EPA has actually set up a campaign to dig up and repair leaky tanks. 1/3 of the underground tanks housing radioactive waste at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in Washington are leaking into the groundwater supplies. So they have been able to tell that these tanks are leaking radioactive compounds, which is not good. This was built in the 1940s, and we've actually spent billions of dollars on remediation efforts here. Um, Agriculture can also contribute to groundwater pollution. It's been seen that most pesticides are found in most aquifers, but not over the EPA standards for drinking water, so we haven't done much about it. There's a lot of nitrates from fertilizers found in groundwater, and this can lead to cancers, miscarriages, and birth problems. We have been able to reduce pollution. Water pollution has been reduced greatly by the passage of the Clean Water Act of 1977, which before that was the Federal Water Pollution Act. It has set standards for contamination levels in surface waters and funded constructions of water treatment plants or sewage treatment plants. However, in the recent years, underfunding and understaffing has led to an increase in undocumented violations. Oh, in documented violations, numbering more than 100,000 per year. So there's more than 100,000 documented violations of the Clean Water Act each year. And so that's not even accounting for the undocumented violations. The Great Lakes in North America, in the Midwest, are a really good success story. At one point, they declared Lake Erie a dead lake, but they have been able to reduce toxic chemicals by 71%, phosphorus by 80%, and chlorinated pollutants by 82%.